Hi, I'm Vic Hartman. Today's topic is holding third parties liable for the criminal acts of others. Specifically, we're going to look at the case of Jeffrey Epstein and the banks JP Morgan Chase and Deutsche Bank. When individuals are harmed, we want our judicial system to come forward and compensate the victims. In this case, Jeffrey Epstein victimized and sex trafficked hundreds of young women, sometimes as young as 14, around the world to various locations where he resided, primarily for his own benefit, but there's also evidence that he engaged in sex trafficking for other high-profile men. Jeffrey Epstein died by suicide in August of 2019 when he was waiting his second trial for sex trafficking. The question is, how do we compensate these women? How do we try to make these women whole through the judicial process? Before we answer that question, let's look into the background of Jeffrey Epstein. He was born in 1953 in Brooklyn, New York. He was 66 years old when he died. He was never attended college, or he didn't finish his college education. He did not hold a professional license. His first job, interestingly enough, was a school teacher where he taught physics and mathematics. He was fired for disciplinary reasons. He was extremely brilliant and smart and charismatic, which probably helped him both to acquire wealth and to entice young females to his benefit. After being fired as a school teacher, he went to work for Bear Stearns. He quickly rose to the ranks, became an options trader, and he started rubbing elbows with some of the wealthiest individuals at Bear Stearns. He later developed a business relationship with Les Wexner, a owner of a retail conglomerate and a billionaire himself. That relationship really catapulted him into the social scene and enabled him to become affiliates with extremely wealthy individuals from around the world. As he became acquiring his wealth, he needed financial institutions. His first banking relationship that he had with, at least a major banking relationship, was JP Morgan Chase. He had that relationship from 1998 through 2013, of which he stopped that relationship and then went over to Deutsche Bank from 2013 to 2018. It was through that banking relationship, and this relationship was really symbiotic. That is, they needed him because he was bringing in millions of dollars in fees through the banking relationship, and he needed them for two reasons. One is cash. He needed access to large amounts of cash, as we'll see. And he also needed, for his own business purposes, those relationships that JP Morgan brought to him. So let's talk about his wealth. He's reported to be a billionaire. That's maybe subject to some dispute. He was certainly extremely wealthy. The Jane Doe plaintiffs are now trying to sue him, so their attorneys are looking for his wealth. There was the Paradise Papers leak that came from a Applebee's firm, which is a law firm in Bermuda, which specialized in trying to obscure and obfuscate the wealth of extremely wealthy people. He hired that firm. At the time of his death, the estate and executors behind it were trying to look for this wealth, and to date, they have found $630 million. Now let's talk about Epstein's sex trafficking. He was a prolific sex trafficker. He engaged this on a massive scale. He had sexual encounters with underage girls, sometimes several girls a day in and day out, and this went on for well over a decade. He was just a prolific sex trafficker. And the way he did this, it really can only be described as a pyramid scheme, and he used cash. So he plied these girls with cash. When they would come in, he would initially say it was a massage, but it quickly turned to a sexual encounter. And then he paid them. The purpose of these payments, and they were paid hundreds of dollars for each of these encounters, for each of these girls. It was for two purposes. One is kind of a hush money. So if they didn't want to come back, it was kind of a hush money. It was also to recruit other girls. So these girls would go out and recruit other girls because he had this humongous sexual appetite for young women. It was just horrific. He was also aided by Ghislaine Maxwell. She was his longtime paramour, and she too was responsible for recruiting. And he gave the girls cash, but he also gave them other gifts, sometimes tuition. Got to have relationships with these on a longer period of time. and just gave them lots of money and different things of value. He engaged in most of his illegal sexual encounters in his mansion in New York, though he was not limited there. He also had these encounters in West Palm Beach in Florida. He had owned an island called Little St. James in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and he had these encounters in England and France and on his corporate jet. So just a prolific sex trafficker. Finally, this caught up with him, and the Palm Beach police, and started around 2006, and for a couple of years, 13-month investigation. They started undercover operations, and they started scratching the surface and found out what they were up against here: a sex trafficker, abuser of underage women. The chief police thought he had a very strong case, but he started getting resistance from the state prosecutors. So with that resistance, they really just didn't want to charge hard and substantial offenses against Epstein. So the chief went to the FBI and then brought in the federal authorities to start investigating this, which kind of confirmed the extent of the sex trafficking. For whatever reason, this became widely known later, the U.S. attorney for Miami didn't want to charge this case. So he had all the parties sign a non-prosecution agreement. This enabled the state authorities to go forward and exclusively prosecute. Epstein didn't want to have exposure in two different jurisdictions, so the feds said, we'll sign a non-prosecution agreement. We'll give you state authorities the ability to have exclusive prosecution. And they did charge him with 2 counts for prostitution with underage girls. But he only got 18 months. And the story it gets worse even from here. When he serves his sentence, he's in his own exclusive part of the jail called a stockade. They never locked the door. He had an open door, had a TV, had a conference room for his attorneys. And then was part of a release program where 6 days a week, he got released for 12 hours to go to his office and work. And here he further engaged underage girls. It's been reported as well. So this was quite the prison sentence, right? 18 months, but he got released throughout the day. At the end of this, his prison sentence is over, and he serves like a year of home confinement in his mansion in Palm Beach, Florida. But his sex trafficking does not stop there. It goes on then for another decade. So from 2009, when he's released, up to 2019, now it's only grown. More and more women, hundreds of women, more and more cash has been paid. And finally, federal authorities, the FBI in New York, investigates this again, and now they prosecute him federally. So he gets arrested in August of 2019 while he's waiting trial for sex trafficking and conspiracy to sex traffic. In New York, he then commits suicide. So, the victims never got the satisfaction of going through a prosecution and seeing him sentenced. He did commit suicide, and this has been subject to many conspiracies of whether and what was the cause of his death. There was initially a FBI investigation which found suicide, and then recently released, the Office of Inspector General from the Department of Justice just did a comprehensive investigation, which was recently released, and it too found that Epstein committed suicide. And some of the notable facts were, prior to his ultimate death, he attempted suicide like a couple weeks earlier. He did this through the sheets and linens in his jail cell, fashioned several nooses actually that were found there after his death, and then tied one orange noose around his neck, tied it to the top of his bunk, and it strangled him. And the findings were of the autopsy, the broken bones in the neck, which was consistent with suicide, and the bruising around the area. And most importantly, there wasn't any defensive wounds. That is, if somebody else was trying to strangle in this fashion, there would have been scuffle in the area which was photographed, and there'd also be defensive wounds, none of which were found. Now, to answer our question, how do these hundreds of Epstein's victims get compensated? These victims are often known as Jane Doe. They're able under the law to pursue their cases in court anonymously under the title of Jane Doe. There's actually 2 big buckets, or 2 pots of funds where they may be able to recoup monies for their losses. The first is, which you might expect, is the Epstein estate. So to date, that was $630 million that the executors of this state have found. And so Jane Doe lawsuits are occurring all over the place and trying to pursue that pot of money. One of the biggest ones so far is actually the U.S. Virgin Islands, which have brought a suit and successfully settled very recently for $105 million. Part of that was for an unrelated fraud that Epstein committed in the Virgin Islands. And then the rest is going to go towards some sex offender funds in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So not actually to compensate the very specific victims, but that does leave 500 million so that some of the Jane Doe plaintiffs can go forward. But the next big pot of fund is third-party liability, and that's the banks J.P. Morgan and Deutsche Bank. And here's the theory of those cases, and these have already settled. The first settlement was actually brought by the New York Department of Financial Services, which brought a case against Deutsche Bank, and that was settled for $150 million. Then there was a lawsuit, Jane Doe versus Deutsche Bank, that settled for $75 million. And there's a very recent settlement of Jane Doe versus JP Morgan Chase, and that was settled for $290 million. So here's the theory of that liability. Banks are the most highly regulated industry in the country, in the US, and this is probably true worldwide. So banks are very highly regulated. The Bank Secrecy Act is part of that regulation with anti-money laundering rules, but there's rules known as know your customer and customer due diligence. So these banks had an affirmative duty to know who Epstein was, and they did. In fact, it's well documented. They put him as a high-risk client, and he was high risk. He was a registered sex offender in Florida and New York. You just Googled his name, and you'd see all these Jane Doe lawsuits. You'd see all the litigation. You would see over time that he was a convicted sex offender and what he'd done. So he's high risk. But here's the linchpin to this whole case. Under the Bank Secrecy Act, which the banks are obligated to follow, when you pull out cash, and cash is the key to this whole thing. Without cash, Jeffrey Epstein couldn't have fueled this sex pyramid, applying these girls with cash so they would bring in yet other girls. So, and this, we're talking lots of money. For example, the New York Department of Financial Services found in just a 4-year period for Deutsche Bank that he withdrew $800,000. He actually did this through his attorney. His attorney would go to the bank and pull out $7,500 multiple times a month for a month in and a month out for a 4-year period. So he averaged each year $200,000. And this money is almost certainly the money that was going to these girls. Most of them were actually abused in his mansion in New York. The attorney was doing this on Epstein's behalf. He said the banks would ask him under some of the forms, the cash transaction reports. Like for instance, he went into the bank once and pulled out more than $10,000, or tried to, and they said, "Well, we're going to fill out a CTR, cash transaction report." He says, "Well, I don't want to do that," so he broke it up into 2 deposits. Well, that's to defeat the filing of a CTR, which is known as smurfing or structuring. The bank said, "Look, you can't do that." They called him out on it, said, "We're going to report this." So he just went back to withdrawing $7,500 multiple times a month. On one occasion, he went to the bank and withdrew $100,000. So these are all red flags to the bank. So the banks knew that he was doing this. It was well reported internally to the banks that he was drawing out this cash. The banks, the Department of Financial Services also ultimately found that in the case of Deutsche Bank, unsafe and unsound banking practices, and that's why they settled that for $75 million. But that is really the theory for the liability here, is you have a well-known sex offender, and he was pulling out hundreds of thousands of dollars of cash. When the banks asked the attorney, what were you doing this for? And he said it was for tipping and for traveling for Epstein. So not a super good answer if I'm pulling out $800,000 over a 4-year period. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I'm Vic Hartman with the Hartman firm in Atlanta, Georgia. My firm specializes in forensic accounting, internal investigations, and fraud mitigation consulting.